All right, the Supreme Court has just handed out a pretty important decision with respect to the presidential election this year. And I got to tell you, as it becomes more and more obvious that Trump is actually leading in the polls, and I'm not just talking about for the primary where he's just decimating Nikki Haley, but actually leading in the polls for the general election over Joe Biden, a couple of things are happening. I mean, obviously, the Democrats have decided that they're going to take a more moderate tone and they're going to lean into the middle and they're really going to try to reach voters that don't traditionally vote for him, right? Nope, that's exactly not what they're doing. They're doing the complete opposite. In fact, if you don't agree with them on pretty much everything, you're a filthy MAGA extremist. And we're going to show you some of the craziest articles, some of the craziest studies that have just come out that have pretty much said that if you are white and male and live in a rural area, well, quite frankly, you're the problem. And so we're going to analyze, are you the problem? Am I the problem? We're going to talk about all of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Good Ranchers. As always, I am your host, Nick Freitas, member of the Virginia House of Delegates, but other than that, a fairly good guy. Back with us is my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And of course, we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, not to mention mostly benevolent warlord in training, Christian Hines. How you doing, Christian?
I am the problem, Nick.
Well, that one we could probably all agree with. There might be some bipartisan support that Christian is the problem. And then, of course, we have our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking. But unfortunately, he's not feeling too good right now. So he's probably not going to be talking a lot today. And so we want to encourage everyone to once again go on Circle, join our community chat. So many of the episodes that we do have been heavily influenced or just outright suggested by the members within our community over in Circle. Go ahead and check that out. It's going to be in the show notes. Information right there on the channel. So let's go ahead and get right into this. So as late as a couple hours ago, I was entreated to a floor speech on the Virginia House of Delegates, where one of my colleagues got up and proceeded to bring up the whole Charlottesville rally in 2017, and once again pushed the narrative that Trump and his supporters essentially. If not outright white supremacists, are basically supporting a bunch of white supremacists. And it doesn't seem to matter how many times we point out that Trump didn't say that, Trump supporters didn't say that. It doesn't seem to matter how many people, on the right might not necessarily even be the biggest Trump fans, right? If they would rather have Trump as president than Biden as president, then for all the left cares, you're a white supremacist, you're a white nationalist, you're a Christian nationalist, you're a MAGA extremist, whatever the case may be, you're it. And you are, in fact, the problem. And one of the things that we want to show here is a couple of articles, because I think the left is going to have to come to grips with something, and that is that despite the fact that I think they honestly believed that after 2020, right, after the 2020 election, nobody was going to vote for Donald Trump anymore. In fact, I think they thought nobody was voting for Republicans anymore. And even when Joe Biden has done, quite frankly, a pretty horrible job when it comes to everything from the drawing down of troops and finally pulling out of Afghanistan, to the economy, to what's going on in Ukraine, to what's going on within the Middle East, and being on the brink of the United States potentially being involved in even more wars than we have been over the last 20 to 25 years. Despite all of that, I think they just thought that as long as Trump was the nominee, as long as Donald Trump was the Republican nominee, they were going to win this thing. And it didn't matter. They could literally put an empty suit in front of a podium, put a D on it, and say that's the guy that's going to win. And lo and behold, more and more polls are coming out to show that actually Trump has an advantage in the general election, oftentimes in swing states. And here's the crazy part. Some people are probably thinking, okay, yeah, great, fine. He's got a poll done by, the Heritage Foundation, right? Or he's got a poll done by the Republican Party that demonstrates this. Actually, it's coming from some places you probably wouldn't expect. So let's go ahead and pull up this first New York Times poll. And Christian, as our political prognosticator and analyst, walk us through this poll a little bit and give us a little bit of an explanation on why people are starting to flip out, and it's starting to question. It's starting to cause a lot of us to question whether or not Biden actually will be the Democrat nominee because the numbers don't look good for him.
Well, I think Biden's going to be the nominee at this point, barring like a black swan type event, right? But I think that's actually kind of the problem because he consistently is trailing Trump in the polling. And to give you an idea, like In 2020, the official final numbers were that Biden won the popular vote nationwide by 4 points, like almost exactly 4 points. And the polling in 2020 showed that he was supposed to win by like 6, 7, 8 points. He actually massively underperformed the polling. People kind of forget this. Like Texas was supposed to be in play in 2020. He was supposed to win every swing state other than Iowa. And Ohio was like on the edge. Well, he lost Ohio by 9 points. He lost Iowa by like 9 points. Texas ended up not being close. It was like by 5. And these like upper Midwestern states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. I know people point out that Pennsylvania is technically not upper Midwest, but politically, geographically, it has much more in common with, Michigan and Wisconsin than it does with...
Their food's very Midwest.
Yeah. And so like those 3 states decided the presidency, and then you could argue Georgia and Arizona as well. Well, Biden was leading by like 6 or 7 points in Wisconsin when he ended up winning it by like literally like 0.2%.
Yeah.
So that's what happened 4 years ago. Now fast forward, and you would think, if you're especially on the left, you would think like, well, nobody's going to vote for Donald Trump, right? Because of January 6th, threats to democracy, some of the other stuff that we're going to bring up today. But I mean, we have even the New York Times, not exactly a conservative bastion of, red-pilled right-wing thought, right? We have the New York Times put out a poll that came out recently that showed, quite frankly, that showed Biden getting steamrolled. This came out like literally like a day or 2 ago. So here's the headline from the New York Times. And it says, voters doubt Biden's leadership and favor Trump, New York Times Siena poll finds. And then it goes on to say the share of voters who strongly disapprove of President Biden's handling of his job has reached 47%, higher than the Times Siena poll at any point in his presidency. And here's where the kicker comes in. The top line results of if the 2024 presidential election were held today, who would you vote for if the candidates were Joe Biden and Donald Trump? Trump is at 48% and Biden is at 43%.
Is that outside the margin?
Oh, way outside the margin.
Because isn't it usually about 3%?
Yeah.
Yeah, about 3%.
That's way outside the margin. 5-point difference with Trump almost at outright 50%. And keep in mind, this doesn't include things like third-party candidates. I know that we've talked before about like who RFK could poll from, but I could tell you who Colonel West is going to be polling from and who Jill Stein's going to be polling from. They're not going to be polling from Donald Trump. So, like, this is just quite frankly a disaster. If you're the incumbent president and you're polling at 43% and almost half the country strongly disapproves, not somewhat, strongly disapproves of you, that's a disaster waiting to happen. And I'm not going to go through like the entire article word by word, but there's a few points in here that really like stick out. The one is the age difference. The other one is the coalition that's starting to fray, and this is actually crucially important for the later part of this podcast when it comes to the reaction that you're going to see from the Democrats, from the left, the DNC, and their water-carrying allies in the media. If you actually dig into the crosstabs of this poll, what you find is that the reason that Trump is leading Biden outright in the popular vote right now, keep in mind, he lost the popular vote twice, right? He lost it in 2016 and he lost it in 2020, although he did drastically outperform his polling. So that's another thing that's worth noting. But this point's incredibly important for the rest of this podcast, because the reason that Trump is now leading in the polling is because what used to form the core of the Democratic coalition is starting to fall apart. The Democratic coalition historically was built off of working class voters, blue collar voters, and it was built off of minority voters. And in particular, it was built off of working class minority voters. So like Hispanics and blacks and Asians that didn't have a college degree. Well, the polling shows that those groups, especially blacks and Hispanics that don't have a college degree, they're still supporting Biden overwhelmingly. But it went from historically, you're talking like 70, 80% for Democrats to like 2-1 or like 60-40.
Well, and this is the part that's important to understand. And we've mentioned this before when it comes to things like urban areas. And this is Christian's donut theory. And we've done entire episodes kind of dedicated to this and watching how, if you look at the 5 boroughs in New York City from 2016 to 2020, all of those 5 boroughs, except for one, drastically moved to the right. Now, the reason why you don't see it or hear about it, or the reason why it doesn't change the congressional representation, is because when AOC wins her first election by 85% of the vote and then wins her second one by 73%, they're going to say she won in a landslide. When in reality, there was a over 10-point shift to the right. That's not insignificant. And it ends up affecting things like, gubernatorial races within the state. And it can end up obviously affecting presidential races. So these are the sort of things that have, we're starting to see more of. And I would say, and again, I see it all the time when, especially when I'm down here in Richmond, where I am watching where it's almost like they can't compute it in their minds, right? They have a hard time, looking at us or looking at anybody that would even consider voting for Trump as a decent human being that maybe has, different priorities than them, or as somebody that, thinks that Donald Trump did a good job. Like that doesn't compute. If you were sitting down and you're trying to explain, well, here's all the reasons. Let's say you even concede. Let's say you even sit down with a Democrat and you say, hey, look, I don't like Trump's mean tweets, right? Or I wish he would get off the internet, or I wish he would stop saying this, or I wish even if a Republican concedes all of those points that really, hurt some people's sensibilities about Donald Trump. And then they say, but I thought the tax cuts were a good idea. And look, I like the fact that he didn't expand, U.S. military involvement in other places, right? I like the fact that, jobs started to come back because people saw the United States as an easier place to invest and start a business, right? I liked all of those things. And I like the fact that he was doing something about the border, because even cities like New York and Denver and Chicago and Washington, D.C. are starting to recognize that, oh gosh, yeah, there are some problems when essentially the border's just kind of open, right? So even if you make all those caveats and you say those things, right? Even if you say, yeah, I wish Trump would have said this better. I wish he would have handled this situation better with respect to the way he articulated his position. But policy for policy, pound for pound, I think the country was better off under Trump than it was under Biden. They're not going to come back and say, well, what about this? No, it's he's a racist. You're voting for a racist, so therefore you must be a racist. And it's amazing because I want to switch to this part where, this is the part where, again, the Democrats kind of lose the plot on this, where if your little bubble is nothing but a bunch of progressive liberals at the university coffee shop saying the same things you are, well, then obviously, in your world, Trump can't be seen as anything other than a horrible, evil, mean white supremacist, and therefore, who would vote for him except for evil, mean white supremacists or people that are just stupid, right? Those are the two categories you get. You can be evil, you can be stupid. And some people say, well, Nick, that's an oversimplification. They're not pushing that. Okay, well, let's take a look, right? Because we're starting to see more and more, papers come out. There was this article that came out by someone, I think she was, or not an article, she was doing an interview on MSNBC. And this reporter comes right out and basically says, well, Christian nationalists. So again, we're taking a term. By the way, almost nobody identifies as a Christian nationalist, in part because there's probably very, very few people that could sit there and articulate and give you a fixed definition of what that actually means. But she decided to define it as, well, a Christian nationalist is one of these crazy people, right, that think that your rights come from God and not from government. And we're all kind of sitting here looking like, oh, you mean like in the Declaration of Independence where it says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Like pretty much every founding father, John Adams came out and said that our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people and is totally unsuited to any other. There was a reason why our entire country was built on this notion of what you would call God-given rights, or what others might call natural rights. It was the idea that these rights are unalienable and they are yours by virtue of being a human being. Now, the left will point out, like, well, that's convenient, but women didn't have those rights and slaves. Fair point.
Yeah, but they were on the wrong side of all those issues.
Exactly.
So.
Fair point. And the argument was that because they are unalienable, that because we've drafted this into our Declaration of Independence, and because that sort of philosophy informed our Constitution, then the fact that people were denied certain basic civil liberties was a violation of that principle. Right? Like, I want to look at this MSNBC report and say, so you prefer your rights come from government? Because if they do, well, then government could just as easily give them to you or take them away or redefine what they are.
I think they do like that idea. Even if you just look overseas, you look at the UK and things like that, and how they will prosecute people for speech. I mean, overwhelmingly for speech they don't like. And they justify it and it's crazy to me, this idea that they love certain rights and they hate other rights, and they want to be the ones to choose who gets to exercise that right. So like, you can exercise freedom of speech, but this other person can't because they're the wrong color, or they're the wrong gender, or they're the wrong sexual preference, or whatever it is. And I tend to think that some of this demonizing the right and demonizing, like calling everybody Christian nationalists who would vote for Trump, I think they've laid a lot of groundwork to vilify anybody who would vote for Trump. It's not enough just to vilify Trump, because everybody can come up with a reason why they need to vote for this guy because he's the lesser of two evils, or whatever, however they justify it in their head. But people have a tendency to want to follow other people. They want to follow whatever's popular, the popular narrative. And so if they do a good enough job of bludgeoning the rural American and basically talking about Trump and anyone who would support him as being this horrible, awful, bigoted, terrible human being, the worst of the worst, scum, well, then you're going to have a nice big swath of people that have been trained to follow what they think is the good guy because of this whole oppressor-oppressed dynamic we have going on now. And you don't want to be in the oppressor class, and they're trying to paint anybody who would vote for Trump for any reason as part of the oppressor dynamic, and people are going to want to stray away from that because everybody's been trained to do so and follow what the media says. So I feel like they're laying the groundwork to get people not to vote for Trump so that they're not in that category.
I think that's part of it. I think definitely it's stigma, right? It's associating stigma with something. But they've done this for a long time, right? Well, they will take a term, or they will take, racism, white supremacy. They'll take things like that, which, again, the reason why they use these terms is because nobody wants to be associated with them.
We have a visceral reaction to it.
Well, yeah, which is, and that's an appropriate visceral reaction, right? Like the Democratic Party, for most of its history, ran on white supremacy. It didn't run away from it. It put it right there on the ballot. It said, yeah, this is what we believe. What's fascinating is that now that we've entered a time where, thankfully, to outwardly express any sort of support for a truly racist position or a white supremacist position, that is absolute political suicide in this country, right? That's that's death. But here's what I don't understand. The same Democrats that are telling us that the country is just essentially full of a bunch of unrepentant, racist, sexist, white supremacists, and yet they can't really show you one, major elected Republican. I mean, they'll point to all of us and say, you're all that because you voted for Trump. Right. But they can't really point to any like real policy positions and say, well, aha, clear, here's where it is. This is what proves it. It's all things like unconscious bias, or it's all like if you want any sort of restrictions on abortion whatsoever, you must be sexist, which is weird because they also believe that men could have babies. So how could it be a sexist position? Right. And that's where it comes back to, what James Lindsay says a lot of the time, where it's like the issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. The issue is how do you accumulate and consolidate political power? And one of the strategies is that you blanket your political opposition with all of these, toxic terms that they don't want to be associated with. But again, I think it's interesting to consider that if the country were as racist and evil and bigoted and as white supremacist as they claim, why would they actually accuse people of that? Because that would be a rallying cry, right? That would help you get elected in certain areas if that's what you actually were. And I think the other thing that's going on right now is I think the left has also come to grips with something, and that is they don't, it's not as if they are bothering to try to reach out to various groups that they've lost. It's not that they're bothering to try to bring around other people that might have been loyal Democratic voters as 10, 15, 20 years ago. They are now completely otherizing them, right? And there's another article we're going to get to. I don't want to screw up the rotation here, but there's another article that we're going to get to here that talks about the whole rural versus urban divide. And again, it really kind of shows where the mindset is at this point. There's another article I want to get to here, and this is the whole idea of the threat to democracy argument, right? So you're racist, you're sexist, you're bigoted, and you're a threat to democracy. And I want people to understand something. We've talked a little bit on the show before about people that will go onto college campuses, and especially when the argument comes up about trans. One of the things that you'll see with trans is if you deny the idea, or if you deny the idea that men can become women simply by identifying as such, or vice versa, right? Then you are, quote, denying the existence of trans people, which means you are then, proposing genocide against trans people, which means your speech is an act of violence. And one of the things that we've pointed out is that the reason why they're doing this is not just to shut you up. The reason why they're doing this is because they're also laying a groundwork for being able to use violence against you, whether that violence is coming up and punching you in the face like they did to Riley Gaines, whether it's intimidating people like they did to Kristen Hawkins over at VCU, whether it's using the government to do so in order to tell you that, hey, we're going to take away your business if you don't bake us the cake we want, or we're going to potentially take away your tax-exempt status at the church, or we're going, it's all these things where it's like, we're going to use force against you because you disagreeing with us is the equivalent of violence against us, right? That's their argument. And so this is just fair turn of play. Well, this article came out, and I actually got asked to speak about it on Fox Business back on Friday, but it's this, this white rural Trump supporters are a threat to democracy. Okay, so now we're narrowing this a little bit, right? It's not just white men anymore. It's not just MAGA extremists. Now we're talking about white rural Trump supporters. And there was these two guys that did this study, and they basically came to the conclusion that if you're white rural male, chances are you're far more prone to believe in conspiracy theories. You're far more comfortable with the use of violence as a way to achieve your political objectives. You're racist, you're sexist, you're homophobic, you're anti-LGBTQ, right? This is kind of how they've now branded white rural voters. And it's amazing because I can't imagine them taking any other rural group of people at this point and then branding them all a particular thing based off of their geography and their skin color. But they have absolutely no problem doing it when it comes to white people in general, and specifically white males and now white rural voters, because they feel like they've already lost that group. And so now the objective is to, position those people not just as your political opposition, but to position those people as a threat to democracy. So understand the importance of the words that are being used here. They're not just saying, we disagree with these people and we want to beat them at the polls. Let's get out there. Or they're not even, and they're certainly not saying, hey, let's get out there and convince your neighbor that this isn't the way to vote because, we're going to do a better job with respect to agricultural policy, or we're going to do a better job with respect to tax policy. No, that's not the argument. It's like, hey, everyone, look over there. Do you know someone that is a white rural male? Then chances are they're a threat to democracy. They're your enemy.
Right.
Am I wrong?
Yeah.
Is that not how they're categorizing this?
So remember when I brought up the New York Times poll?
Yeah.
There's an interesting fact that's buried in that poll that's like, way deep down in the article that the Times doesn't really talk about unless you read halfway through it. And I want to read it right now because it's actually hilarious considering the reaction that we're seeing from the left in response to the fact that, like, it is looking like there's a decent chance. I'm not going to say it's inevitable. I'm not going to say it's guaranteed, but there's a decent chance that Donald Trump will win the presidency and be the first Republican in 20 years to win the popular vote. I don't think it's inevitable, but that is what all the polling shows right now. If the election were held today, he would almost certainly win the White House and he would almost certainly beat Joe Biden in the popular vote. He might not get a majority because of third-party candidates, but
yeah.
Again, like, here's the trend from Real Clear Politics, by the way, in case anybody thinks this is like a one-off thing. This New York Times poll that's right here.
Jeez.
In the middle of what is a bunch of Trump +2 to Trump +4 polls, with one exception being Quinnipiac. Here's the trend line.
Yeah.
Remember, by the way, to do a comparison really quickly.
Well, and explain to our audio listeners real quick too, is what we're looking at right now, because basically what Christian was showing is that he had a chart up there from Real Clear Politics that showed, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of around 12 polls, and out of the 12, Trump was leading in all of them with the exception of one.
Yes. So to give you an idea of like where things are today versus where things were previously, right? In 2020, what you ended up seeing was, here it is. Here was the trend line of the polling in 2020. Notice anything different here?
Once again, for our audio listeners, you got about 12 polls up there, and all of them showed Biden leading by fairly significant margin.
This was the 2020 polling right before the election, and it showed Biden leading in every single poll, literally every single poll. I think Trump led in one poll of the general election cycle. Maybe it was two. And the trend line was insane. Like by election day, the average of all the polling showed Biden leading by 7 points, over 7 points. That's like Obama 2008 numbers for anybody that's keeping score. And he ended up winning by 4, right? And so that's where we were in 2020. Trump didn't lead a single poll in the 2020 election cycle, again, with like 1 or 2 exceptions. And you're talking like 50 polls, right? More than that potentially. And here's where we are today.
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite. And here's the trend line. Trump has led in the average of all the polling, because it's not about one poll, right? You could, polling has methodology errors, right? If you want an accurate depiction of things, you don't look at one poll, you look at the collection of polls and you look at the trend line of where they're going, right? When you look at the collection of polls and you look at the trend line, what you see is that Trump has consistently led Joe Biden since early September last year. Like consistently led him. And the gap now is like Trump +2, over Trump +2. So we've gone from Biden +4 or Biden +4.5 to Trump +2.3. That's a 6-point shift to the right in 4 years. If you were to see a uniform, and you won't, right? Because some states will shift left, some states will shift right more than others, right? But hypothetically, if you were to see a uniform shift to the right by 6 points nationwide, Trump wins in a landslide. Yeah. Like he wins every single competitive state in a landslide. He gets within a hair of Minnesota, for crying out loud. So
I have a question.
That's where the polling is. Yeah, go ahead, Tina.
So my question is this, and I did not ask you this beforehand. So if you do not know this, it is totally okay. But you did mention that the polls, he massively outperformed his polling last time, and Biden underperformed. And it does seem like when you're really connected to politics, you start to realize that some of these polls have just been really off lately. For the past probably decade, it's been really hard to get decent polling. And you could blame a lot of things for that. I mean, everybody uses cell phones now, and we block those numbers, and usually they're trying to call landlines or whatever, or things get blocked. But anyway, there's a lot of reasons why polling may not be as accurate as it used to be. But do you know if they've changed any methodology to try to hone it in a little bit and get better numbers out of this?
So there's a reason that, like, and I actually tweeted about this a few days ago, where somebody was bringing up this New York Times poll that we brought up at the beginning of this podcast, and they were just quite frankly coping and seething over it. They were like, there's no way, the New York Times are a bunch of right-wing extremists for putting out this poll. I'm dead serious.
Yeah,
this is what they were saying.
They're white nationalists, everybody.
Yeah, the New York Times are white nationalists.
Yeah, good gosh.
And so, like, that things have gotten bad when people on the left are attacking the New York Times for putting out this polling. But again, there's one thing buried in this poll that I think is actually crucially important, especially in light of the fact that you have outlets like the Daily Beast bringing up things like saying that rural white, Trump voters are the threat to democracy. So read this paragraph right here.
It says, Mr. Trump is winning 97% of those who say they voted for him 4 years ago, and virtually none of his past supporters said they are casting a ballot for Mr. Biden. In contrast, Mr. Biden is winning only 83% of his 2020 voters, with 10% saying they now back Mr. Trump. Oh my gosh, that's incredible.
You guys know what the implications for this is, right?
Wait.
The reason that Trump is leading, Tina, is not because of...
It's not because of a love of Trump.
No. Trump supporters do love him.
Right. But like these other people don't. It just shows how bad Biden is.
What it is it's not rural rage. It's not white nationalism. It's not Christian nationalism. It's none of those things. What's happened is that Democrats have radicalized people against them. That's what's happened. That's the reason that Trump is leading in the polling right now. It's not because rural white America decided, I'm going to wake up and I hate everybody that's not me. That's not what's happened. They're just as loyal to Trump as before, in part because can you honestly blame them when you have headlines like this being directed at them, right? Rural right, white rural Trump supporters are a threat to democracy. That's the narrative. That's the message that we're sold from the left. Speaking as technically a rural white, well, at this point, I am a Trump supporter. I cannot believe I'm saying that, because anybody who knows me knows that I did not like this man. I didn't even vote for him. That's something that is kind of intimidating to admit in front of tens of thousands of people that will be listening
Well, you
to
did
this,
the first time, but you didn't the second time, which
I'm
makes
one
it
of these
your fault
weirdos
that Biden's in office.
Yeah, I've got to explain this now, because you just, I have to explain this now. So I got into a huge argument. I was 22 in the first election, and I was a cringe libertarian. Oh man, God forgive me.
I remember arguing so hard with you and being like, do it for the justices. Just do it for the Supreme Court justices.
And my mother did the same thing. So my mother was a hardcore, still is, a hardcore Trump supporter. And we got into so many fights. And I was still living at home with my parents at the time. And because I was just out of college. And I remember getting into so many fights, and I was just like, I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I was still a libertarian at the time. I had very socially progressive views, certainly compared to today. I was still very much on the right when it comes to economics, but I didn't agree with almost anything he was saying. And I remember making some of the same arguments that the left currently makes. I remember making an argument that Trump is a fascist to my mother in 2016. And she browbeat me into eventually on election day. And I remember this because Nick was upset because I didn't get to the polling place in time, because I was still working for him in his office. and I was at home the entire morning for 3 hours on election day, arguing with my mother about this. And eventually, finally, after 3 hours, and we had been arguing for like 6 months, and eventually I was just like, if I just vote for the guy, will you just leave me alone? And she was like, yes. So I did it.
And then
because I thought he was going to lose. I didn't think it made a difference. And then he ended up winning.
I remember at some point that day, I received a GIF on my phone from Christian that was Anakin after he had gone and done what he did. And what have I done?
Oh, yeah. After he kills Mace Windu. Yeah. So like that was the thing. And then I couldn't stomach 4 years later. I was 26 at that point. This was in 2020, and I could not bring myself to do it again. And I didn't. I threw my vote away and voted for the third-party libertarian candidate in 2020. Well, and in the last 4 years, I have become... Remember when I brought up that Democrats have radicalized people against them? I'm one of those people. I never was a Democrat, but like I will crawl through broken glass over a mile in order to vote for Donald Trump at this point. And by the way, if you're an early listener of this podcast, because we've been doing this for almost 2 years now, where the four of us, right? Nick, myself, Tina, and Hamilton.
You can see Christian's character arc.
2 years ago, I remember saying things like, I'm worried who the Republicans are going to nominate because I don't want them to nominate Trump again. So, I mean, it was a 4 year long process, but now it's really in the last 2 years that I've gotten to a point where it's like, no, my enemies must be defeated because this is what they're selling the American people, right? Which is, if you're white and you live in rural America, you are evil. You are the enemy. Well, they're basically broadcasting that they hate my guts no matter what I do. So there's no virtue signaling I can do. There's no middle ground that I can appeal to. Mm-hmm. There's no compromise I can appeal to. I can criticize Trump's behavior all day long. I can criticize his tweets all day long. I can even point to specific policy points that I don't agree with him on. But guess what? None of that matters in these people's eyes because I'm a threat to democracy. Well, okay, so I was hinting at this for a long time, right? That when you dig into the polling, though, what's interesting is that the reason that Trump is leading is not because of people like me, although you could argue it's somewhat because of people like me, because I didn't vote for him 4 years ago, and I will this time. But no, what's really happened is that people that voted for Biden, and I didn't vote for Biden 4 years ago. I never would have voted for somebody like Biden. But nonetheless, people that voted for Biden 4 years ago are switching. Not all of them, not even a majority of them. But when Biden is only leading with 83% of his own core base of voters from 4 years ago, that tells you something. That tells you that he's losing his own coalition. And guess what? His coalition were not rural, MAGA, white conservatives 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So this idea that they're the threat to democracy, no, what's really happening is, quite frankly, is Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters and some white voters, the few remaining ones that aren't college indoctrinated lunatics that are writing books like this, because by the way, the people that wrote that book about, white rural rage, one of them was a former columnist for the Washington Post, not exactly a conservative bastion. The other one is a professor at the University of Maryland at Baltimore. I'm willing to bet there's maybe 5 conservatives on that entire campus. So again, I just find it really fascinating that they're lashing out at one group of people when it's an entirely another group of people that are actually responsible for the fact that Biden is currently trailing in the polling right now.
All right, but the craziest poll that I've seen recently was the one that I just conducted with myself, which said that Good Ranchers is the best out there, and you really got to go to goodranchers.com right now, put in promo code Nick, sign up for one of their subscriptions, because on top of getting the best American-raised beef, poultry, pork, wild-caught seafood, right? You sign up for the subscription now, you put in promo code Nick, you're going to get a free 10-pound Easter ham with that subscription. That's pretty hard to beat because, again, you need to understand something. When you go to the grocery store, right, and you're buying your meat products and you see a little American flag on there, you're probably thinking that pig, that cow, that chicken, whatever it is, was raised here in the United States. Not necessarily. You would be shocked at what they're permitted to put on beef and other meat products that says product of the United States, when in reality it was raised in a feedlot in a different country. So if you want, again, quality American-raised meats, ones that don't have a bunch of crazy mRNA vaccines and things like that, go to goodranchers.com, put in promo code Nick, sign up for one of those subscriptions, get yourself a free 10-pound Easter ham to go with it, right? I promise you're not going to regret it. Goodranchers.com, go and check it out. All right. So let's go to the next part here, because I think one of the things that we've established up front is that voting for Trump, or I would say this way, if you support Trump now, right, it doesn't matter with what kind of caveats you might put in there. That's almost like an unforgivable sin. It's an unforgivable sin, and it's one of those things that they have such a hard time wrapping their minds around that they almost feel at this point that they feel like they've got this mountain of evidence. Oh my gosh, look, he had an $83 million decision in a sexual assault charge. Yeah, but most people look at that and say, okay, but that was ridiculous. He got fined $83 million for basically, saying that he didn't do this, and then basically calling the woman names, calling her a liar.
It was basically like defamation, right?
Yeah, an $83 million decision for defamation like that. That's just, the woman that accused him, it is clearly not all there, right? If you've seen article, she's clearly not all there. And then she's sitting there on TV bragging about the money that she's going to spend. And hey, I'm going to get myself something, and I'm going to get talking to the reporter. I'm going to get you something too. What would you like? It's so obvious. One of those, the fix is in. Then you look at this case down in Georgia, right? And you see all the scandal that's going on there. Then you see the case that was brought by,
in New York,
New York, right? New York, where all of a sudden it's like they're going after him about real estate deals for which no one was harmed.
There was no victim. Yeah.
Right. No victim. Everyone's looking at this going, what exactly is going on? So, and not to mention the fact that throughout his entire presidency was, Russian collusion, and he was doing this. And more what we end up seeing is that either one, the claims are very, very shady, or they're going after Trump for things that they've done, like classified documents. Really? You've heard of Hillary Clinton, right? At this point, I think what's happened when you look at this pivot that Democrats are making now. For a while, they had made a lot of arguments that, Trump's a racist, and if you vote for him, you're a racist. But they kind of accuse all of us of being racist and white supremacists anytime we disagree with them. And so that kind of, I think to a lot of people, it was just like, yeah, whatever. You say this all the time. And now they're getting more specific with this idea of white rural men. And I think there's something to this because of the polling that Christian just pointed out, right? Christian pointed out that one of the big problems that we have right now, or that Biden has right now, is that it's not that he's failing to convince white rural voters. He didn't have them anyways. He's losing people that voted for him back in 2020. And it's almost as like there's this major shift to try to signal to their voters that if you vote for Trump, you're like one of these people. And we all know how much we hate these people. And then in addition to that, it is almost like they're so frustrated with this because they feel like there's this mountain of evidence that Trump is a horrible bigot and racist, and he's a criminal, right? For them, he's a traitor and he's a criminal. And What more evidence do you need? Don't you know that he lost a case with respect to sexual assault and he $83 million fine? Yeah, until you actually look at it a little bit more and you realize that the woman that made the accusation doesn't seem to be all there, and an $83 million defamation fine on that seems a little excessive, right, with respect to what they're doing. And then you see this case down in Georgia where they're going after him with respect to counting the ballots down in Georgia. And then you see the scandals associated with that. And then you look throughout his entire presidency where they were constantly trying to do essentially tribunals through the House claiming that he was engaged in Russian collusion. And that all fell through. And then you look at what they're doing up in New York City right now where they over $340 million fine. There was no victim. There was no victim. Right? Then you look at things like, look at all the classified documents. Are you serious? You had no problem when Hillary Clinton was doing this, and she didn't have the same authorization to declassify documents as Trump did. So the Democrats sit there and they make all these arguments like, how could you support this? Well, because we think you lie about him all the time. We think you lie about him, and we think you're actually weaponizing the justice system against him, which actually makes him more sympathetic to a lot of people. Not to mention the fact that when you say all these evil, horrible things about him, which again, has Trump done some bad things? Yes. I don't think it's good to cheat on your wife. He's done some bad things. By the same token, though, we've noticed that you accuse him of a lot of things that we know he's not guilty of, or he's never been proven guilty of. And then you turn around and you accuse us of the same things. And so a pattern has been established. A pattern has been established that voting for Trump or supporting Trump is the unforgivable sin, and that we're now a threat to democracy, and you're willing to do just about anything to defeat us, whether it's slandering us, whether it's using the criminal justice system against us, whether it's using the tax system against us, whether it's using the school system against us, whether it's deplatforming people that you don't like or don't agree with. See, we're all looking at the Democrats right now and we're thinking, dude, you guys are the bullies. You're the one using the state apparatus to go after the people you disagree with. You're the one trying to ruin people, whether it's their reputation, their business. You're the one trying to ruin people. And now we have this next step, right? And that is this whole idea of trying to get Trump off the ballot. Right? Off of this claim that, well, Trump is guilty of fostering an insurrection. Okay, well, you don't really have a conviction associated with that. So this is more about individual states, individual blue states, deciding that Trump is such a threat to democracy, and all of us idiots, especially in rural America, are such a threat to democracy that we can't even be afforded the opportunity to vote for Donald Trump because he's a traitor. And if you were going to vote for him, you're a traitor. And so we saw this starting in Colorado. We saw it up in Maine. Where was it also, Christian? Was it Michigan?
It was, there was an attempt in Chicago as well.
Yeah.
To remove him from the ballot in Illinois. It was starting to spread to other places. There were a few Democrat Secretary of States that said things like, depending on what the Supreme Court says, we'll then remove him if we're allowed to, but we're going to wait for the court to render judgment. But Colorado and Maine were the big ones. And Maine was arguably the bigger one because Colorado has become totally overrun with woke, blue-haired lunatics in Denver at this point. That the state's kind of gone. But Maine is actually competitive, which is crazy because 20 years ago it was the reverse, where Maine was the liberal state and Colorado was the swing state. But Maine's actually competitive. Trump almost won Maine outright in 2016. And even though he lost Maine convincingly in 2020, he did win a congressional seat in Maine. And Maine is one of only two states, along with Nebraska, that breaks up their electoral votes by congressional district. So when Trump won the 2nd district in northern Maine, he won an electoral vote from doing that. Yeah. And when you're talking about a race that could potentially be as close as the one that we're looking at right now, where it's like 6 states or 5 states decide the entire outcome, having one extra electoral vote out of a state that you would otherwise get none out of literally could be the difference between winning and losing. There are electoral combinations where it's like Trump wins 3 or 4 of the major swing states and he wins this electoral vote in Maine, and that gives him his 270th electoral vote or his 269th, which would throw it to the House. And depending on who wins a majority of the congressional seats within the state delegations, then they become the president. Keep in mind, you need to remember that for the future because that last point I just brought up about whoever controls the majority of the state delegations in the House of Representatives could determine the actual winner in a tie situation or a situation where nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes, that's actually going to be really important for a few minutes from now. But to your point, though, the main situation is big, right? Because that could have actually taken away electoral votes from Trump. And the Supreme Court came out on Monday, March 4th, and said, no, you cannot do this because Trump has not been convicted. I actually read the rendered opinion.
It was unanimous, too.
It was a unanimous 9-0 opinion. Who knew that Elena Kagan was a right-wing, based red-pilled
They're all
conservative?
MAGA extremists now.
Oh, you didn't hear Keith Olbermann? Keith Olbermann came out and slammed all three of the liberal justices and then said the Supreme Court clearly needs to be dissolved. Right? So there you go. Your sage, your left-wing sage over there decides that the Supreme Court rendered a decision I don't like, so therefore the Supreme Court needs to be dissolved. These are coming from the people that, again, say the rest of us are a threat to our form of government and way of life. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, again, that's where a lot of people too, and this is the part where the left has way overplayed their hands when it comes to trying to prosecute Trump in court. Because nobody, let's say this, two things can be true at once, right? You can look at the way that Trump has done certain things and said, okay, did he maybe fudge the number on the value of that real estate transaction? Sure, that's a possibility. Okay, great. Is that unusual? Well, no. Do Democrat donors do it all the time? Yeah, they do. Okay, is anybody being prosecuted except for Trump? No, absolutely not. Okay, well, that tells me everything I need to know. This isn't something that you were desperately trying to rigorously enforce the law because a crime had been committed and victims needed justice. That's not what was going on. You don't like him. You don't want him to be president. You're trying to bankrupt him, right? Did you really need to award $83 million in a defamation suit because Trump claimed that he did not actually assault this woman? And again, she's clearly not all there. Now, does that mean Trump's not guilty of that? Well, again, if you want to play it out in court properly the way it's supposed to, fine. But really what this comes down to is $83 million. You didn't do that because you did not do that because that is a typical judgment for something like that. You did it because it's Trump.
Right. And these are all civil cases because criminal cases aren't working out so well for them. So in civil cases, you can just make it a monetary thing, and you just find somebody who's really, really sympathetic to your cause, your Democrat cause, and have no jury. I can't even believe that the New York situation, there was no jury to do this. This was just unilateral decision by one judge. And for that 300, how much was that in New York?
It was
I think it was 345 million.
Yeah, it was way
and
north
barring him from doing business there and things like that. Like they want to confiscate his buildings and his assets.
They want to, again, they see this as nobody believes that they are doing this just because Trump did something so egregious and just ripped off so many people that he has to be punished. That's not what they've acknowledged. That's not what's going on.
If that were the case, they would give the money to the people.
Then why are you doing it? And the reason why you are doing it is because you're using the law to take out a political opponent. And again, it is having the opposite effect. And it's not just having the opposite effect on people that were already predisposed to vote for Trump because they think it would be better than Biden. It's having that effect too on other people that are looking at this going, yeah, this isn't right. There's something fundamentally wrong about doing this because if they'll do it to him, then they'll do it to other people they don't like. And they're not wrong when you come to that analysis.
No, they found a mechanism to have the government be able to take the earnings of citizens with no victim. It's not like they're making a victim whole. They're putting that money into the coffers to be spent as though, just like tax dollars, just like how they steal from you every April 15th or whatever. They found a loophole to do that to the rich people. And I'm telling you, there's going to be a wealthy exodus if that holds, if that stands.
Yeah. Well, there's already, because New York State is crumbling by the minute right now. I mean,
it's the next Detroit.
New York City lost, I think it was Manhattan alone, lost 100,000 people in 1 year right after COVID. Like New York City is losing. And the thing is, the people that are moving out are the people that have the financial resources to do so. But that's a whole nother discussion, although we've brought this up repeatedly. In fact, we've done Y Minutes on this topic of like why New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco are shrinking, like literally shrinking. It's because of terrible policies. But like what I find so fascinating about this whole saga right now that you're seeing playing out within federal law enforcement, state level, like attorneys general, district attorneys like the prosecutor in Georgia. Like what's so fascinating is how transparent they are about what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Like some of these people literally campaigned for the office they were elected in as attorney general or as district attorney on elect me and I will prosecute Donald Trump on X, Y, and Z. Like they literally put that like on their literature, on their campaign platform and ran on that platform. And then they got elected and they did it. And quite frankly, I think that what's happening right now is that people on the right, to explain what's going on with the rural white rage, what's happening is that people on the right, and quite frankly, some people that even voted for Joe Biden 4 years ago that are now totally disillusioned and disaffected with the state of America and where things are going, as evident by this New York Times poll. Like, I mean, here's another thing that we missed from it, which is like the share of people that are enthusiastic or disappointed or basically different moods when it comes to the two candidates. It's like almost a majority of Trump's base of supporters are quote unquote enthusiastic about voting for him. Whereas it's an overwhelming plurality of Biden supporters are simply satisfied but not enthusiastic. And over a quarter of them are actually dissatisfied with the prospect of voting for him. So like the excitement, right? The intensity of this upcoming election, the roles are overwhelmingly slanted in one direction, with one side being more than willing to show up and vote for their guy. And the other side is basically, disappointed in their own choices. And I think that reflects itself in the polling too, that we talked about earlier, that it's like Biden's only retaining 83% of his own voters. These are people that voted for him 4 years ago, to say nothing of new voters, right? Or people that voted for third-party candidates. And I think that what's happened is that there's a huge chunk of America. A lot of them are on the right, but not all of them are. Some of them used to be on the left until 5 minutes ago. And they're seeing that the Democratic Party has adopted arguably the most cynical approach to politics that you could possibly adopt. Although I will say it's incredibly cynical, but it is also incredibly effective. And it's this. It's you seize power, and then you wield that power in order to reward your friends and punish your enemies. And it's as simple as that. It begins with you seize power, you reward your friends, and you punish your enemies. The end. Mm-hmm. And that's an incredibly cynical approach to politics, but quite frankly, it is effective. And when you look at regimes all throughout history, right? You can go all the way back to like Sulla. What did Sulla do? He persecuted his enemies, right? He purged his enemies. Tiberius did the same thing. Like this has been going on for thousands of years. Sulla would take power, he purged his enemies, and he rewarded his friends. Look at what happened within the Soviet Union, right? Stalin takes power, he purges his enemies, he purges Trotsky, and he rewards his friends.
Well,
like it happens all throughout history.
It does, but the thing within the U.S., there's been something of a different political tradition. I'm not going to pretend it's always been pristine, but it's certainly in many respects been better than that. The problem is that we are at a point right now, and again, I get a front row seat to it. I've had a front row seat to it for the past 55 so odd days, and it's the idea that again, you're not just wrong on policy. You're bad, you're evil, you're a threat to democracy, and therefore we have to make you completely toxic. We have to make the idea of not just Trump as the bad guy, but you as the bad guy too. And you don't want to be associated with those bad guys. Right? That's what this comes down to. That's why we're seeing Democrats being able to justify tactics that would have been considered completely unacceptable 15, 20 years ago. 15, 20 years ago, you would not have seen, you would have seen some tricky stuff, you would have seen some shady stuff, but this idea that we're going to weaponize the DOJ against people, that we're going to engage in practices with respect to detainment, with respect to prosecution, with respect to literally trying to bankrupt people, we're trying to keep them on the ballot. I mean, keep in mind, there hasn't been an effort to keep somebody off the ballot like this since the Civil War. Right, it was Abraham Lincoln that I believe didn't show up on, I think it was 9 of the ballots in the South, and he still managed to win the presidency.
Nick, it's it's even more nefarious than that. Because remember when we were bringing up how the Supreme Court 9-0 ruled that Colorado and Maine and some of these other states like Illinois cannot remove Trump from the ballot because he hasn't been convicted of anything. And it's not the jurisdiction of those state secretaries or district attorneys in some cases to say Trump's not allowed on the ballot in our state because we're talking about a federal election. Well, Democrats have a plan, and it's not the plan is not how do we win back the 20% of people that voted for us 4 years ago that don't want to now, or how do we win over people that we didn't win over in the first election? How do we get them to side with us and convince them that that they should vote for us a second time? It's not that at all. It's literally how do we disqualify our opposition? And this is quite frankly the most cynical thing out of this entire story right now, because we all remember January 6th. And the point of January 6th, and the left tries to remind us every single day, was the protesters at January 6th, you can say rightly or wrongly, but they had one goal in mind, which was to stop the certification of electors of states that they objected to. Now, we can go back and say, well, they should have still certified, and they did, right? Every single state was still eventually certified. But it doesn't matter your opinion on the certification itself. We all know what's not in doubt. Everybody knows this, regardless of their political views, if they cheered it on or they thought it was worse than 9/11, right? The goal was to prevent the certification of states like Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. In doing so, it would have thrown the election to the House and given Trump an outside chance of winning the White House again. That was the goal. That was the explicit goal. The Democrats are literally bragging on their own platforms that they've ideologically captured about how they want to do the exact same thing. The exact same thing. I'm not saying like rhetorically the same thing. I mean literally the exact same thing. I have a headline from The Atlantic. Again, not exactly a hyper-conservative platform.
Quite the opposite.
Where it's titled, How Democrats Could Disqualify Trump If the Supreme Court Doesn't. And then it goes on to say, without clear guidance from the court, well, now we do have clear guidance. The Supreme Court said you can't do this. But it goes on to say, without clear guidance from the court, House Democrats suggest that they might not certify a Trump win on January 6th. That is literally what the January 6th protesters in 2021 wanted their side to do. And now you're seeing the left openly embrace the idea that if Democrats win, remember when I brought up the whole majority of state delegations? This is what determines it. If Democrats win a majority of state delegations in the House, not a majority of seats, a majority of state delegations, although usually those two things are correlated, but not always. If they win a majority of state delegations in the House, they might actually attempt to do that which the January 6th protesters failed to achieve. And keep in mind, this could take place if Trump even wins the popular vote. So at what point do you say, who's the real threat to democracy here? Is it the guy that's on the verge of winning the popular vote for the first time in 20 years as a Republican and doing it on the backs of disaffected people that voted for Democrats 4 years ago? Or is it the people that are saying, you know what, to hell or high water, it doesn't matter how this guy gets gets to 270. If he does, first off, we attempted to block him from getting to 270 by trying to remove his name from the ballot. And then when the Supreme Court told us no, we decided to then literally conspire to steal. And yes, this is an appropriate use of the term. Literally conspire to steal the election from this man in the House of Representatives, which, by the way, is the exact same thing that they have spent 4 years now ruthlessly attacking Republicans for. They have wielded January 6th as a weapon against anybody that disagrees with them and basically say, if you don't agree with us, you are a fascist, authoritarian, strongman supporting dictator who wants to destroy this country and tear down democracy. I have heard those arguments from people on the left. I've heard those arguments from people on the left in my own family, accusing me, who didn't even vote for the guy 4 years ago, of being an authoritarian, strongman supporting fascist. Why? Because some people on January 6th had the exact same idea that Democrats now want to explore in this election cycle.
Well, hold on. Can I chime in here real quick? It is interesting though, because the Supreme Court basically refused to let him be kicked off the ballot. It does kind of give them the ability to go ahead and carry out that type of a thing, knowing there's already Supreme Court precedent to keep themselves sort of safe from the retaliation that they're now dishing out. So it's almost like they're seeing it as permission to go ahead and engage in this to a probably stronger degree than they're claiming the Republicans did.
I think I remember the 2016 inauguration, and I remember the 2016 when they were certifying voters there, and you had Democrats that didn't want to certify the vote, and they were celebrated by the left. And I remember Molotov cocktails being thrown and bricks through windows and stuff being thrown at motorcades and whatnot. And again, none of it was advertised as insurrection. Now keep in mind, it was smaller in scale than what happened on January 6th. What I find, again, interesting about all of this is when you get accused of being a threat to democracy, just keep in mind, they're not saying that in terms of, I don't like the way you vote, or I think your ideas are dangerous. It is essentially giving them moral justification to use whatever means necessary in order to defeat you. If that means impeaching you on trumped up, no pun intended, charges with respect to Russian collusion. If it means attempting to bankrupt you through the court system, if it means tying you up in the court in various cases or whatnot that they can't get sufficient evidence to actually win, if it means keeping your name off of the ballot, if it means throwing out voter ID laws in certain states, if it means 45-day mail-in voting, if it means letting 3 million people into the country, and keep in mind, whenever we talk about that, people are like, well, that has nothing to do with voting. Oh yeah, sure it doesn't. Again, I sat here on the floor of the General Assembly where they actually passed a bill out of the House that said you could have come over to the country illegally and be a chief of police as long as you went through DACA, right? As long as you met the DACA criteria, so you came over to the United States illegally when you were 15, okay, you could stay in the United States, you could be a police officer in Virginia, you could be chief of police and not be here legally. Or technically they say, well, you are here legally because you're covered under DACA. Right? Every time we point out that, wait a second, we should not be doing this. So like, these are members of our community. How much longer is it going to be? They already tried to pass another bill that said that they could serve on commissions, right? So serve on commissions, serve within law enforcement. How long is it going to be before they say these members, what they say is are undocumented members of our community? How long is it going to be before the undocumented members of our community should be permitted to vote? Like, does anybody think it is crazy to suggest that the Democratic Party will not be openly advocating for people that are in the country illegally to be able to vote as undocumented members of our community? And they'll make the argument. They serve on the police force. They serve on commissions. They pay taxes. They have driver's IDs. They live in these communities. They contribute to these communities. They protect these communities. Why shouldn't they be afforded the opportunity to vote in these communities? And this will be the argument. So again, all of us on the right, who, again, they're constantly accusing of trying to steal elections because of what a relatively small number of people attempted to do on January 6th, right? Despite the fact that they've essentially weaponized the DOJ, they've weaponized the government apparatus, they've refused to actually fulfill their constitutional obligations by securing the border. They're openly advocating for people that are in the country illegally to be able to come in and then actually vote, sometimes in municipal elections and serve other areas, right? They're doing all of this, and they're looking at us going, you're trying to steal the election. Really? Really? Now, here's what I want anybody. And look, I don't care where you are on the political spectrum when I say this. If you think this is okay, and you think it can all be justified by just simply accusing, well, that everybody that disagrees with me is, a suffering from white rural rage and is a sexist and a bigot and a homophobe and a threat to democracy, and therefore, if we have to essentially disenfranchise them, or we have to take away their choice, if we're going to do it because we're the good guys, just keep in mind that the precedent that you are setting, the precedent that you are establishing right now will be used against you, I promise you. And it won't be used against you by people like me or the other people on this, but because regardless of what I think of Joe Biden, or regardless of what I think about these sort of tactics, I don't want to use the government to punish my fellow citizens that I disagree with. I don't. But I will tell you right now, you're going to turn guys like me into a minority real quick because we're just going to look like we're weak. That's what's going to be said. It's like, oh, Freitas, that guy doesn't want to use the full force of government to punish his political opposition the way his political opposition punished us. He's clearly too weak for the position. We need someone that's willing to do to them what they do to us. And what's fascinating is then if that happens, that's when you're going to see people on the left go like, oh my gosh, we warned you. No, you didn't warn us. You created it. You didn't warn. You contributed to it. Because you decided to weaponize the government against people that disagreed with you. So don't be shocked. I'm telling you right now because I don't want it to get to that. I don't want to get to that point. I would love it if we could still have some semblance of fair and honest elections where people with different policy positions could debate those policy positions. And then based off of the outcome of those fair, open, and transparent elections, we accepted it. And if we didn't like the results, then we work to try to improve or to change the results next time around. Or we work to try to convince people to think the way that we do on a particular policy position so we can get the representation that we want. But right now what I'm seeing is that if you don't agree with us, you're bad, you're evil, you're a threat to democracy. We can otherize you. We can threaten our own people that are starting to break ranks because they don't like some of the extremism that's going on within the Democratic Party. We can threaten them that you even dare consider leaving here and we're going to associate you with all these people over here. Is that what you want? Do you want to lose all of your cultural access into the positions that we've given you by daring to disagree with us? We don't need to just prosecute Trump. We can prosecute our own too if they break ranks. Like, you don't think that message is getting through? That's the problem. Everything the Democratic Party stacks up as evidence against Donald Trump right now appears to a lot of people, and not just as hardcore supporters, it appears to a lot of people as you've got it out for this guy and you're willing to do literally anything to take him down, to include cheating. And nobody likes that, except for your radicalized base. And I'm sorry, but you can... I have no doubt you can go into any area of this country, whether it be urban, whether it be rural, whether it be suburban, and you can find crazies. You can find crazies. I get it. But you're creating a scenario right now where anybody who disagrees with you falls within that category, and therefore they can be ostracized and punished. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to tell you what I said on Fox Business the other night when they were talking about, white rural men are the biggest threat to this country. Let me go ahead and lay this out as simply as I can. If rural men were the real threat to this country, you'd know it. You would absolutely know it. If the people raising your food, growing your food, if the people that are disproportionately joining the military and fighting your wars, if the people who disproportionately own the most guns in the country, if they really wanted to be a problem for you, believe me, they would be. They want to try to live in peace. They want to just run their business, raise their family, take their kids to school without having them being indoctrinated. That's all they want. They don't care what you do. They don't care what you want to do over in your little circle over here. They don't care. If you're a dude and you want to wear a dress, your business, they don't particularly care. Don't do story hour for their children. And what they've consistently been told is, no, you need this. You have to have this. Because you're bigoted, and the way that we're going to cure this bigotry within your rural areas is we're going to be the ones responsible for, exposing your kids to these ideas, or we're going to mandate it through the tax system, or we're going to mandate it through regulations. Okay, if that's what you want to do, let me just promise you, you're going to run into a bunch of people that are not going to take that line down. And it's not because we're all mean and evil and violent and bloodthirsty. That's not it at all. What you will find out of the vast majority of people living in rural areas is they just want to be left alone. They want to be left alone. But you keep insisting on telling them what they're supposed to think, how they're supposed to behave, what they're supposed to drive, how they're supposed to run their business, what they're supposed to expose their kids to, and you won't let up. And when they finally look at you and say, well, screw this, I'm going to vote for the guy that's going to fight back against you. You call them racist and you say they're the biggest threat to the country. All right, well, I got news for you. There's a lot of people, especially when it comes to the agricultural communities. I got to tell you right now, there's a lot of people in urban areas that are going to find out real quick, you can't eat your gender studies degree. And maybe alienating the people that actually make your food possible is a bad idea. I don't know.
I feel like they're running into the same thing. Like when Governor Youngkin here in Virginia was elected, there was something that was the overwhelming vibe because of what's his name? Who was the guy that ran against him?
Terry McAuliffe.
Terry McAuliffe, thank you. Terry McAuliffe basically came out and said the quiet part out loud, saying that they didn't believe that parents should have a right to direct their kids' education. Basically, this isn't a parental rights issue. Education belongs to the state. Basically, no parental involvement necessary. And we ended up winning the gubernatorial and the lieutenant governor and the AG race, all because of education choice and demonizing the parents. Because what you had going on is we want to hold this information back from parents because parents are basically the enemy. Parents aren't safe. They're the bad guy. We can't trust parents. And as soon as you saw this tilt, the parents went, oh, wait a minute. No. And they came out in force and we took the governorship. We should not have won that. But Terry McAuliffe thought he was safe enough to say the quiet part out loud. And that's basically what the left is doing right now.
They can't help themselves but say the quiet part out loud.
No, they can't. I mean, you even have I think it was yesterday, Washington State finally passed that law saying that it's an informant line to inform on racial, any kind of bias, hate crimes, which is one thing. And then what did they call it? It was bias.
Implicit bias or unconscious bias.
Hate crimes and bias incidents. And so they're establishing something through the state where you can call in and say, at this place of business, they didn't treat me right because of X, Y, and Z. And now they are going to come under investigation. And you've got this, like, anytime there's something where there's like a code violation or something like that, the left does love to use these apparatuses to try to take down businesses that have political opinions they don't like, and various other things like that. But this is a statewide apparatus. They would love to implement something like that nationally so that we could basically inform on each other. And
you see this all the time in policy. Like, we'll have bills and sometimes they'll be like, how could you vote against that bill that simply requires a business to inform people of their, or how could you vote on that? Or how could you vote against a bill that gives a civil cause of action for an employee to be able to sue their employee? Let me give you an example of how far this goes. In Virginia this year, we had a bill where if let's say a coffee shop owner, I like to use a coffee shop owner because a coffee shop employed two of my children as like their first jobs. Let's say that they go in for a job and the employer sits down and this is her day where she's reviewing resumes and potentially hiring people. And so she has 4 or 5 people come into the shop and she says, hey, have you ever worked with coffee before? And they say, yeah, I have before. I worked over at the Starbucks. Oh, okay. Well, what'd you get paid at the Starbucks? Now you might say, well, I got paid $11 an hour. You might say, oh, I don't really, feel comfortable sharing that, or I don't want to, whatever. Say whatever you want. Well, now if this bill passes, which hopefully the governor will veto it, but if this bill passes, you could be guilty of up to $11,000 in fines or civil action with penalties to $11,000, right? 2 years after it took place. Right? So law goes into effect July 1. You're not paying attention. Just July 2 happens to be the day that you do, resume reviews. You sit down, you talk to 4 or 5, potential employees. You ask them all how much they made at their last job that was similar to yours in order to get a gauge of kind of what they're expecting with respect to pay. Some of them answer, some of them don't. And then one of them says, you know what? The law changed in Virginia. Now all 4 of them can come back and sue you for damages that would go into the tens of thousands of dollars because you asked how much they made at their last job. Now, people say, well, then simply follow the law and don't ask that. Okay, but 1, it's their business. Why shouldn't they be allowed to ask it? 2, what if they didn't catch up with that latest edition because it never occurred to them that would be a law?
Or what if they didn't ask it and the person says they did?
And again, that's the other part too. This is the other thing that people don't seem to understand, because they'll say, well, as long as you're not doing anything wrong, what do you have to fear? I'll tell you what have to fear: constantly getting drug into court. Because if you're trying to run a business on the margins, right? If you're trying to run your farm on the margins and you're constantly getting called into court because somebody has accused you of something that you didn't do, and now you've got to lawyer up, you've got to go in there, you've got to take a time off of work in order to do it. See, and the left just sits there like, well, we're just making sure everyone plays by the rules.
Or
And
they
you're
say,
making it
if that hurts your business, you shouldn't have a business.
Yeah. Oh, they say that.
They say it out loud.
Yeah. If you couldn't do that, you should go out of business, right?
They cannot help but say the quiet part out loud.
Yeah. And it's becoming, and that is, they're at a point right now where they literally can't help it. They have to go with the most extreme version of whatever the left is putting out because they've worked themselves into this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. And as long as it's the oppressed saying it, and again, it could be something like, well, yeah, if you don't engage in, if you don't affirm your child's gender dysphoria, then you're guilty of child abuse. They are terrified to vote against that. They certainly won't speak out against it. They may quietly kill it in a subcommittee somewhere if they think it goes too far, but give it a couple years, they'll be right back and they'll all vote for it in lockstep. That's where they're at.
Nick, I want us to wrap up here with talking about like where things are going, because you said something earlier that I really want our audience to like hear again and for us to kind of close on or talk about as we close, because you brought up earlier that like the problem is not, and I was trying to hint at it earlier too, that like the problem is not, Christian nationalism, like the MSNBC person tried to say, where it's like, if you don't believe your rights come from God, you're a Christian nationalist. Who knew that everybody who's not an atheist is a Christian nationalist? That's not the problem. The problem is not, rural rage, or let alone white rage. And it's not white nationalism or any of these other like buzzwords that have been thrown around. The problem really is, truly is, the Democrats have radicalized people against them. That's what's happened. And it's happened across the spectrum. We've done whole podcasts where we've talked about so many people that used to be on the left that either got excommunicated from the left or the left moved further to the left than they were and it crossed some red line of theirs, right? They either got expelled or they fell off the slippery slope, so to speak. And, and that brings in some other problems about how if you didn't leave the left left you, well, then you're still on the left, which kind of explains the ratchet effect of the whole phrase, that Cthulhu only swims to the left. Mm-hmm. It's because the right is made up of people that 5 minutes ago were on the left. But nonetheless, we've seen this happen, right? We know the names. We could name people like Jordan Peterson. We can name people like Brett Weinstein. We can name people like Dave Rubin. We can name people like Donald Trump for that matter. There's so many people that are prominent on the right now that used to be on the left, and they all have different reasons for leaving the left. And quite frankly, out of all four of those people, I think they all have legitimate reasons for leaving the left. So it's not like that I disagree with them on that. But one thing that I've noticed, and again, you were hinting at it earlier, that like they're going to be like, when the day finally comes where the traitors to democracy, apparently the majority of them out there that are the traitors to democracy, go out there and say things like, you know what? This is how the game is played, right? It's just seize power, reward your friends, and punish your enemies. Great. We'll seize power and reward our friends and punish our enemies. And you have made it abundantly clear over the last, 2 to 3 generations that you are our enemies. When that happens, the left is going to reply with, we were right all along. We tried to warn you. And you brought up, rightfully so, no, you didn't try to warn people. You created the monster. Mm-hmm. I cannot stress enough how dangerous this is. When you go out there and you say things like a majority of the public now are traitors to democracy based on the polling that we've seen. If Trump wins the election, your argument's going to be a majority of America are traitors to their own country.
Yeah.
At what point do they not become traitors, right? And instead they become revolutionaries or reactionaries.
Well, and you see the number of people you see actually saying that right now is, again, it's built off of this idea that if you're gonna call us these things and you're gonna treat us like the enemy, then I'm not gonna act like you're my friend. If you're gonna say I am a threat to our country, well, then I'm not gonna treat you like my fellow countrymen. Why would I? And that's dangerous. But they never seem. Again, they become these self-fulfilling prophets. And it becomes a big game of, see, I told you so. Like, well, yeah, no kidding. You turned up the heat and things got hot. What did you expect to happen? Like, I had people get furious at me when January 6th took place, like 2 days after January 6th. I had a lot of people ask me what I thought about it. And I said, look, I will not stand with anybody that is attempting to use violence to overthrow the process, or that is engaging in vandalism or breaking it. I'm not going to stand with anybody that does that. I think it's wrong, and you deserve to be punished for what you did. Now, I think there's a lot of people on January 6th getting punished for things they didn't do wrong. Like reporting on what was going on is probably not a reason to get arrested by the FBI, but that seems to be happening right now. But what I also pointed out was you don't get to sit there throughout the entire summer as cities are burning, as people are setting up autonomous zones in Portland and Seattle, as people are getting murdered, as businesses are being destroyed, as people's livelihoods are being destroyed. And you don't get to say, summer of love, this is all about just showing what democracy in action looks like and making sure that the voice of the marginalized and the oppressed are heard. You don't get to do that for months on end while simultaneously screaming at the police and everybody else, and then be shocked when the other side says, well, I guess this is the way the game is played. If you celebrated it over here, well, then don't be shocked when somebody else does it over here for things you're not too keen on. You change the rules. And then when your opponent's caught up with you changing the rules, that's when you realize why the rules were there in the first place. Yeah, that's what we've been saying. The problem is that those of us that keep reminding you of that keep getting told that we're the problem. And now the people that we're trying to convince that this is not a road we want to go down are saying, yeah, you've been saying that for a long time now. How far has it gotten you with the other side?
You know, Nick, I heard a line actually repeated quite a lot lately. I think it started with Aaron McIntyre, but if so, I'm going to give him credit, but I don't know if it started with him. Where he made an argument, and he's like a correspondent for The Blaze. He made an argument that there is no such thing as a neutral institution, and we used to think for a long time that there were, but we're at a point in the political cycle now where there's not. The idea that the institutions can be neutral. For example, the Justice Department or the federal law enforcement system, that they can just uphold the rule of law. That is a goal to aspire to, but unfortunately, when you're dealing with one side that tries to treat these things as neutral institutions, for example, the press, right? Think there's so many things out there. There's so many examples out there. We can talk about Wall Street and Silicon Valley as well and how they use things like ESG scores to bully their ideological enemies because they've been captured by the left as well. I mean, we can go on and on and on, and I won't. But like the right for so long believed that there can be institutions that are politically and morally neutral. And the left realized, no, we're going to capture these things and we're going to use them to reward ourselves, funnel money and influence and status to ourselves, make ourselves the elites of society, and we're going to use them to punish our ideological enemies. And guess what? One by one, every single one of those institutions fell to the left. Every single one of those institutions started being perverted and reconfigured in order to elevate and enshrine special protections for the left and their ideological base. And every single one of those institutions have started to be used to be wielded against their ideological enemies. One by one, every single one. And we see it every day. We see examples of it every single day. The law enforcement example is a very prominent one right now with Trump. We just brought up on this podcast about how they've tried to kick him off the ballot, and now that hasn't worked, apparently they're going to try to just simply deny him the election even if he wins in the House, which is exactly what January 6th was all about. And we've seen it certainly within the law enforcement apparatus of the federal government, the DOJ and the FBI, when it comes to persecuting people that weren't even at the Capitol on January 6th, persecuting Donald Trump for things that Democrats are guilty of. And we know, we've done whole shows on this, about the cultural side of this. Again, what Wall Street is doing with ESG scores, what Hollywood is doing, what Silicon Valley is doing. And so I think that people on the right, I think the conservatives are starting to wake up and realize that, correctly or wrongly, that there is no such thing as a morally neutral institution. And when they get to that point, the gloves start to come off, right? Because when the left engages in this sort of sly, fox-like behavior, where they're trying to basically bully their opposition, they're trying to intimidate their opposition, they're trying to wield the incredible institutional power that they've leveraged over the last 50, 60, 70 years through the march, the long march through the institutions. As they try to leverage that power, eventually the right's just going to take the gloves off and be like, oh, okay, we now know. We've been punched in the face enough now that we now know exactly what type of game we're playing. And we're going to play that same game too.
No, that is the concern. And I mean, and if I can, I'll end with this. Probably one of the most shocking things, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, if you really look at it right now, is that Trump's rhetoric tends to be more extreme by comparison, whether it be other Republican presidents that came before him, whether it be other Republican candidates. His rhetoric tends to be extreme, but not his policies. If you look at his policies, he passed one of the widest sweeping criminal justice reform bills at the federal level of any president within my lifetime. He secured the border, but it's not like he shut everything down. It's not like he shut down all of immigration. He didn't get us involved in a bunch of new land wars. He was actually an advocate for non-intervention in a lot of these situations. He wanted to expand trade, but he had policies where he looked at China as not only an economic but a strategic, if not enemy, opposition. He tried to reduce regulations and taxes to make it easier to do business within the United States. But all of the crazy stuff that they wanted to accuse that if Trump gets elected, he's going to do X, Y, and Z, he didn't do it. Now, that doesn't mean I agreed with all of his policies. I didn't agree with pushing the Fed to print $3 trillion. I didn't agree with that. And because I have a goal to be intellectually honest, I'll call it out. But overall, when you look at some of Trump's rhetoric, right, and maybe not even extreme, but it's definitely not the kind we're used to with respect to the American political tradition of people running for president. Now, if you look at Biden's policies, or if you look at Biden's rhetoric, especially during that campaign, was very moderate, very low key, much more in line with our expectation with respect to a presidential candidate. But if you actually look at the policies that he pushed and has been pushing for since he got in, they're far more extreme. They're far more outside the norm of what we would typically expect from the chief executive. You don't get to just declare, hey, I'm going to transfer a bunch of college loan debt from the people that actually took out the debt to the taxpayers. I'm just going to do that. And when the Supreme Court says no, say, well, I'm going to do it anyway. Really? And I'm just going to give hundreds of millions of dollars. We're going to do more in Ukraine. You know, we're going to launch more drone strikes. We're going to push a policy which tries to enshrine abortion up to the point of birth into the law. They want it in the Constitution, right? They want more and more restrictions with respect to your Second Amendment rights. When it comes to actually depriving you of property and liberty, the Biden administration has been far more extreme in their policy than their rhetoric would suggest. When it comes to Trump's policies, they're actually far more moderate and reasonable than what his rhetoric suggests. And that's the difference. I'm not saying that I don't think Trump fights hard. I think he does. But I don't think Trump was actually willing to wield executive power in complete disregard to the Supreme Court like Joe Biden has. And yet Trump's the extremist and Biden isn't. Not because of policies, but because of rhetoric. But now even his rhetoric is becoming more extreme because the left demands it. And so here's what I'll tell you. We didn't do this episode so that we could sit here and just defend Donald Trump. That actually wasn't the point of this. Even though I think he does deserve to be defended on many of these topics that we've spoken about. The point was to demonstrate that the way that the rhetoric has developed on the left has moved from moderate rhetoric and extreme policies to now extreme rhetoric and extreme policies. And that rhetoric becomes more and more extreme, accusing anybody that disagrees with them of some of the most horrible things you could actually accuse another human being of being guilty of. And there doesn't seem to be any consideration for how turning up the temperature in those ways is going to affect the way things go in the future. Or that's exactly what their consideration is. You see, it's one thing to say they don't understand what they're doing. More and more, I'm convinced that they do understand what they're doing. And that's why they're doing it the way they're doing it. It isn't by accident. It's because they've looked at the polls. They've seen where Biden's losing votes. They know what it potentially means for their power. And so engaging in this sort of rhetoric and demonizing half the country and calling them a threat to democracy sets up what they believe to be the moral justification to use the courts and to use law enforcement and to use whatever other means at their disposal in order to achieve the outcome they want. And in the end, it will be completely morally justifiable because after all, they were just trying to save democracy from people like you. And that's pretty dang terrifying. So I just want to point out, like I said earlier, if you really think that rural voters or Trump voters or white rural voters or whatever terminology that they're using now to separate us based off of race or geography or religion or anything else, if you really think they're the problem, I promise you, you'd know it. You would know it if they were. Because they have the capacity to be a far bigger problem to you than you can to them. Again, they raise the food. They grow the food. They're the ones that predominantly serve within the military and law enforcement, disproportionately speaking. They're the ones that own the firearms. They're not the ones shooting things up. They're not the ones trying to shut down and tell other people how to live. But if you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and again, trying to divide people based off of those things, well, then do you really get to be shocked when they one day wake up and figure this is the only way to do it? That's not the sort of country I want to live on. It's not the sort of country I fought for. It's not what I want my kids to grow up in. And so our objective is going to remain the same. We want to defend the founding principles of this country. We want to defend civil discourse. We want to defend peaceful transitions of power. But we're not going to be told we can't be included in that process because we're evil or threats to democracy or bigots, when we're not actually demonstrating any of those attributes or characteristics. You're just using them against us, not because it's true, but because you believe it has political utility. So do us a favor. Avoid a fight you don't want by getting rid of some of that rhetoric. And actually understanding that there's a lot of us out here that we may not agree with you on policy, but we do want to live in peace. We don't want to take away your ability to engage in the economy or to engage in the political process or in our educational or media institutions. We're not trying to deny you that. We're not trying to deplatform you. We're not trying to arrest you. We're not trying to bankrupt you. But the more you continue to do that to us, there's going to be far fewer of us willing to make that argument. And that's just the practical reality. And that's not a threat. That's just a prediction based off of looking at human history and looking at the way people respond to both incentives and threats. And we have reached a point where whatever you call us, it just doesn't matter to us anymore. Again, we don't really care because we know we're not what you claim we are. We know we're not what you claim we are. And we are going to fight for the things that we love and the things that we care about. And if we can do that in a country which, again, believes in peaceful coexistence, even when we disagree. When we agree, we work together. When we disagree, we leave each other alone. If you can agree to that, we can find a pathway forward. If you can't, well, then you force us into a position. Now, don't you? And that's what we need to avoid. Anyways, all right. Well, thank you very much for joining us on this episode. I know we went through quite a few topics, quite a few different polls in there, different issues, and a lot of this is controversial. And I'm sure there's going to be so much more to be able to talk about on this throughout the 2024 presidential election cycle as things kind of heat up. But again, our goal is not to continue to turn up the heat on this. Our goal is to essentially warn people that the heat is getting turned up in a way that everybody should be uncomfortable with. And the solution, again, is not for one side to dominate and impose their will on the other. What's unique about the American experiment is not that we get to vote every 2, 4, or 6 years. What was supposed to be unique about the American experiment is that we didn't have a government so powerful that every single election was the most important one in our lifetime because whoever won was going to dictate to the rest of us how you were supposed to live. That's not who we're supposed to be as a country because that's not what a free country is. So let's continue to fight for the sort of country that we want. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Good Ranchers for sponsoring us, and we will see you next episode.